Hello, welcome to this little drawing session. Today I'm drawing cars and drivers and passengers from the 1908 New York to Paris race, which I'll talk about later on. But I'm also going to talk about using photos for reference and all the things that involves, and a little bit at the end probably about a plan I've got for something I want to do, or something I want to do today. Who knows if it will happen in a few months' time. So yeah, we're using photos for reference. I much prefer to work from life whenever I can, and most of the drawings you see on my website have nearly all been done from life. Occasionally a situation comes around where you can't work from life, so either the car doesn't exist anymore, the subject doesn't exist, or it's the other side of the world, or you're working from your imagination. And so this is one of those occasions. There are a few of the surviving cars from this race left, but they're in America, I think. One's in the museum in Germany. And yeah, so I'm going to have to rely on some photos. And one thing you see an awful lot in car illustration and car art is people tracing photos, which I think is a cardinal sin. I think it brings up all sorts of issues actually, but you're letting yourself down because you're not going to learn an awful lot from just tracing a photo. It's not going to improve your drawing really. You might improve your line quality, but you're really not going to learn much about drawing things in 3 dimensions, studying the proportions of things, anything like that. You're just going to reproduce something that already exists, so it's a waste of time, and you're not doing yourself any favours. And quite aside from that, there are also issues about copyright. I mean, presumably the photo was taken by a photographer who made all sorts of creative decisions and ended up taking a lovely photo, which he was presumably pleased with, and you're just reproducing it for your own gain, maybe for money, which is wrong, morally wrong, and perhaps legally wrong as well in many cases. If the photographer is still alive, then yeah, he owns the rights to that image. And there's a strange grey area, which I'll probably talk about in another film, which is how much you have to change something before it's no longer the original work that you were inspired by. So there is a grey area where at one end of the scale you make a perfect copy, and it's wrong to charge money for a perfect copy of something, even if you did yours in paint and the original was a photograph. At the other end of the scale there's something that's so different that nobody, even if the artist looked at it, he wouldn't recognize it as his own thing. So, and somewhere in between there's this grey area, where's the crossover point? I think if somebody can look at your sketch or painting and see what it was based on, and it reminds them of the original, or if you put the original alongside and they could see, oh yeah, it's definitely, you couldn't have created that piece of work without seeing the original, then I think you haven't changed it enough. Anyway, that's all something to discuss another day, or do leave some comments below if it's something that you're interested in. I think it's an interesting area and something that's affected me in the past because people have made copies of my photos. But let's go on to something a bit more jolly, which is, how do you use photos for reference if you have to? So here I've got my computer in front of me, and it's full of lots of pictures of cars and drivers and stuff that just caught my eye from that time, from 110 years ago. And I just want to get familiar with drawing these cars and drivers. That's my task today. I just want to start making some thumbnail sketches and get used to drawing how they, sort of studying how they look. So rather than tracing anything, I'm just looking at one of these photos and thinking, well, you can see my usual method of putting the axles and the wheels down to get the wheelbase right, and I'm not slavishly copying the perspective necessarily from the photo. I'm doing it roughly from the same angle, but not completely. The original photo was a bit higher than my angle, and maybe a bit further around the front than mine. So I'm just thinking of this sketch as a three-dimensional object. I'm trying to construct like a modeler would, if a computer modeler, if he had those photos and he had to make models, he would look at these photos and start thinking, right, well, there's 4 wheels with this sort of spacing, and there's a sort of a box area for the engine which has an arched top, then there's a platform which has the seats on, and then the back seats are on a slightly higher platform, and then there's a cylinder for the fuel tank. Those kind of things, that's what I'm thinking about as I'm doing these thumbnail sketches. They're kind of working drawings, I suppose, and they'd usually be what I'd put in my sketchbook, but I felt it'd be easier to draw them flat for the camera. So I'm not particularly precious about these. I'm not trying to make something very beautiful. They're kind of analysing how these cars were put together, the proportions, what kind of things are on them. So once you've got your basic cylinders and discs and cubes for the main masses, the sort of, like I said, the engine and those things, and where the seats go, what kind of things have the people on board put on them? There's piles of ropes and huge bundles of spare tyres strapped to the side, and boxes of spares and tools, and all their luggage and all that stuff, and a flag, and all the extra stuff that sits on top. So that's kind of secondary items. So that's what I'm doing, is just by drawing my own interpretations of the photos that are in front of me, I'm learning how the cars were put together, the proportions of those cars, and all the thousands of things that the teams piled on board to take with them, because this was a long race. So let's have a look at the next sketch. The first one was the Thomas Flyer, which is an American car, the winning car. This next one is a Protoss. This was the German team's car. And this one was quite interesting because they had a big kind of tent construction, so they were could potentially have it completely enclosed. I don't know how practical that was when you were zooming along, when you had the rare chances to zoom along. But yeah, it made it a fun thing to draw. So you can see I've just very lightly ghosted in all 4 wheels. You can see the front ones more clearly than the back ones, because I know the back ones are going to be obscured by other things eventually. But just by putting those 4 wheels into a space, you start to think of it as a 3-dimensional space. And then in that 3-dimensional space you can construct a kind of a cube, or for the or a rectangular shape for the engine to go in, a suggestion of the headlights and the wheel arches. So every time you draw, because cars are symmetrical, every time you draw something on your near side, the nearest side to you, have a think about where it would be on the other side. And sometimes it's worth drawing, sometimes you might just make a little mark as a placeholder, to remind you of how deep the car is going to be. So those kind of things, you're just trying to think of it as a 3-dimensional object, not just as an outline of a car, which is perhaps the first thing that people draw when they start to learn how to draw a car. They just think about the outline shape, and they really don't think so much about what's going on under the surface or on the far side of the car, because you can't see it. But it does make sense to be aware of all of those things. It will help you construct sketches that feel more 3-dimensional than if you just look at the outline. Anyway, so that's what I'm doing there. And the race itself, it was a race held in 1908, and it was inspired by a race in 1907 from Peking to Paris, a hugely long race all across land. And they thought, being Americans, maybe we can go one better. We'll go from New York to Paris, and we'll drive the whole way. And you think, well, there's water in the way. Well, the idea was, if they set off in winter, then they could cross America all the way to Alaska, and then cross the Bering Straits if they were frozen, which would be an amazing feat. That way they would be able to not resort to boats in any way, just drive the entire way. And so that was the plan. They set off in when did they set off? In the sort of early 1908. When was it? I've got it written down here somewhere. February, middle of February. And there were 6 teams. So there was a Zust from Italy, a Protoss from Germany, the Thomas Flyer from America, and then 3 French cars, a Césaire Nordin, which is quite a small car, a de Dion Bouton, and a motorblock. And these kind of events, there were several sort of massive, great big events like this in those early years, and they were just they drew tens of thousands of people to the openings, or every town that they crossed. They were in the paper every day. The teams had journalists on board with them who would send messages back, telegrams and things to the papers, so that it was serialized day by day, and people would just follow. It was the most exciting thing going, really. So the race started in the middle of February, and it was cold already, and they started in New York and headed kind of north-ish and straight into huge blizzards and snowstorms, and they just slowed to a crawl. They were just up to their axles and more in snowdrifts. They would have to knock on farmers' doors and ask if, in the middle of the night, and ask if they had horses that they could help tow them out with. They would resort to driving on the train lines, anything that would just help them carry on forwards. And they were pretty much moving in a small pack. They were occasionally overtaking each other, but mostly, you'd get ahead and then you'd drive into a snowdrift, have to dig yourself out, and by the time you'd got anywhere, the other teams had caught you up and they were just sort of driving in your tracks. And then, so it became kind of they'd swap the lead and take turns at digging snow and laying planks down and pushing the route further. And the journey across America took 41 days, which I think was that was the first time anybody had crossed in winter even. And just to put things into perspective, in 1908 there weren't roads. Even if they didn't have snow on them, there weren't roads underneath in a lot of these places. They were just, most people were travelling back and forth across these wildernesses by horse and cart. So it was an off-road race. And when they got to these really remote towns, sort of mining towns, it was the Wild West. There were stories of them arriving in towns and all the miners and the cowboys firing their pistols in the air. It was just, to me, sitting here in the 100 years later in England, it's impossibly exciting. It just seems to have driven into the past, into the Wild West. So there's all sorts of fantastic adventures that they had along the way, and then on this grueling trip. And obviously they had, the car was quite a modern invention still in those days, and they had endless mechanical problems, and they would have to fix those in blacksmiths and get messages back to their manufacturers to send out parts where they could pick them up later along the journey. They'd have to sometimes travel 100 miles by horse, to go collect spare parts and back to the car and fit them. All sorts of things like that. But as they got across America, they ended up getting sort of separated more. The Thomas Flyer was sort of partly through having a great team, but also it seemed a pretty reliable car, and they seemed to get a lot of maybe more favourable help from the natives than the other teams. So they pulled a lead against the other teams, and they were the only ones actually to make it to Alaska, which was a whole other kettle of fish. Alaska in winter is really, really cold, and people just travel around on sledge with dogs. and there are a lot of places that aren't even wide enough to have anything as wide as a car, even if it could travel. So they ended up getting kind of stranded there, realising that the Bering Straits were not frozen enough to drive across, even if they had been able to get to them, and had to get the boat back down to San Francisco. And by that time, the other teams had already started crossing the Pacific to Japan, and so they ended up behind, and they had to talk to the organisers of the race and work out how much time they'd lost by making this extra journey up to Alaska and back. So they decided, we'll give you a couple of weeks for that, and see how well you do catching up. So there was the race carried on across Japan and then on to Siberia, where things got really interesting and muddy. So by then, again, Siberia is perhaps as remote as the Wild West, maybe more so. They were literally just driving through frozen, snowy, muddy plains, going on endlessly, thousands of miles. The only thing that did save them a little bit was the new Trans-Siberian Express railway, and they spent a lot of time driving along on the actual, railway itself, because that's the only kind of surface that seemed solid enough to take a car. A lot of the time they were just driving across swamps and things, and they'd be up to their axles in mud again and hoping for passing horse teams to drag them out. So it was an absolutely grueling race, and for all of the teams that made it, and only 3 teams did make it to the finish in Paris. The first in were the Germans, but there was, of course, this 2-week penalty for the other teams that hadn't gone up to Alaska. So eventually, when the Thomas team appeared in Paris, they were given eventually the win. It took a while, and there was even a final hurdle as they arrived in Paris, sort of in dusk. A policeman stopped them and said, "Oh, your lights are broken. You can't carry on." So they found a passing bicyclist who had a light on his bike, put the bike on the side of the car, and used that as their headlight, and drove to the finish line. So a fascinating story. I've been reading some books. I've just finished the first one, which is George Schuster, who was the winning driver for the Thomas Flyer team. His book's called The Longest Auto Route, and it was written sort of quite a few years after the event with the help of a journalist, I think. And there's another book which I've got called Hard Driving from New York to Paris, which I haven't started yet. That was recommended to me, so I'm going to give that a go as well. So yeah, that's the race itself. I'll be doing some more of these sketches, so I'll as I find out new things about it, I'll report them. But the reason I'm doing these is because I was so taken by the story, and I thought, they're a great subject to draw. I thought, well, wouldn't it be great to do an illustrated sort of telling of this, tell the story in an illustrated way, so maybe as a graphic novel type thing, which I've never done before. So I don't know if that's the right subject for me, because it's an art in itself, and probably ought to spend a few years learning how to do those before I just tackled it just off the top of my head. But then I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to start illustrating the journey in real time? So maybe on the 12th of February, when the race started in 1908, maybe on that day I'll do a sketch showing the start of the race. And then on the 13th of February, if I can find details of what happened every day, I'll draw something that happened on that day. And then I'll carry on doing that for half a year until July. And then maybe at the end of it, there'll be a huge amount of drawings if I manage to stick with it, because there'll be daily drawings for 6 months. And then maybe there'll be a way of combining all of those into some nice graphic novel type format or something like that. Or just, I don't know, leave them as they are as a book. I don't know. Any ideas gratefully accepted in the comments below. Yeah. So anyway, by this point, what am I doing? I'm just sketching some of the drivers and passengers. They're not. I'm not very good at caricatures and that kind of thing. It's just I struggle to recognise people's faces at the best of times, so I really haven't got the what it takes to do beautiful caricatures of people. So all I'm really doing is just looking at what kind of clothes people had, what kind of moustaches that they had, just some simple sort of basic face shapes, and just having fun really, as I did with the cars, just seeing how the cars are put together, and just seeing what kind of clothes people wore in those days, what kind of hats did they have. And there are some really interesting characters. This one I'm drawing now is somebody called Hans Hansen, who was an Arctic explorer, and he's got this massive sort of sticky out ears and a big flat nose. He looks like a giant. Although I've heard that some of his exploits were perhaps bigged up a bit. Maybe he wasn't quite as exciting as he made out to be, but yeah, I need to find out a bit more about him and see. But so he's certainly quite a good character to draw. So I think here we are. Yeah, see his big flat nose in a minute. Just did a square for that. Yeah, so I think the plan is to just keep doing more pages of drawings like this, either in my sketchbook or I'll film them again if I find them interesting. And if I keep doing it, then by February I'll be familiar enough with the cars and the drivers and even the backgrounds that I'll just be able to draw any of those subjects from any angle for wherever I need. So if I need to do a bird's eye view of one of the cars stuck in the mud being towed out by horses, then I'll be able to just make that up without the reference photos, because there are some great photos of the event, but there's also a lot of the stuff that only exists in the stories and hasn't been illustrated or photographed. So that's where I'll need to use my imagination. And as I said at the beginning, if all you did was trace the photos that existed, you'll struggle when it comes to the bits that haven't been photographed. So yeah, always, whenever you can, just if you have to work from photos, then use them in a constructive way to educate yourself as to how something is put together, to use it to analyze a subject rather than just reproducing it. So here I am, I'm just coming up to the last character, which is somebody in one of these massive shaggy coats that was given to the team. I think in Alaska they all got these huge great big coats given to them, which is good fun to draw. So I've pretty much covered everything I was going to talk about, except Patreon. I've just started a Patreon account. So if I did that so that if anybody had been watching these films, I'm planning on making lots of these. So every week, maybe every few days, make another film. So and most of them should be educational in some way or another. And the reason I set the Patreon account up was so that if anybody felt that they had learnt an awful lot, amazingly, from what I'd been saying, or just felt that they had really enjoyed them, found them entertaining, and wanted to send me a few quid, then that was a way to do it, and I'd be very grateful for that. But I didn't want to hide any of the material behind a paywall necessarily, so all of these films will be free, and I thoroughly intend for anybody who can't afford to pay for these things that they should, I want those people still to enjoy watching these and learning from them. It doesn't sit right with me to charge for sharing stuff that other people taught me over the years. So I'm gonna, it's perfectly, I'm perfectly happy for you to watch them for free. Please do. But if you have enjoyed them and you do want to leave something, then please do join my Patreon account. And there are a couple of perks, not educational ones, but you can join in a monthly live stream where you can send in your own pictures for a critique. I'll try and help you if you're having problems with anything. And also there will be free draws for original artwork. Or if you join the top tier, then you just literally get artwork in your post box every month. So do take a look at that if you're interested. And that's it for now. So thanks for watching. Hope you found it interesting. Do let me know in the comments below, and see you for the next one.